today?
Tēnā koutou katoa, tēnā tātou katoa, no mai, haere mai. Hello everybody and welcome to this New Zealand Association of Gerontology webinar on the topical issue of older drivers. My name's Kay Shannon. I'm from the School of Nursing at AUT. I'm joined by my colleagues from the New Zealand Association of Gerontology Executive Board, Rosie Gibson from Massey University and Mary Brenny from Massey University in hosting this webinar. We have three speakers who will address the topic from the perspective of researchers, practitioners and the community. The speakers are Associate Professor Rebecca McLean, researcher and steering group meeting member of the Transport Research Network, Professor Ngaire Kerse, medical practitioner and academic, and Pete Matcham, policy analyst and community advocate. Each of these people will speak for 20 minutes and there will be time for questions and discussion at the end. Either pop your questions in the chat or use the raise hand function. You'll get the best experience if you switch to speaker view, which you can find just to the left of sign in. Is it at the top of your screen? So our first speaker is Rebecca McLean. Welcome, Rebecca.
Hello, thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, and change my view so I can see myself. Not see myself. So can everybody see my screen? Because I can no longer see everybody else.
Yes,
yep,
I can see
perfect.
it.
Thank you. So kia ora koutou everybody, and thank you to the NZAG for the invitation to speak today. So what I'm going to do is share some reflections on what we think NZPATHS has helped us to understand about mobility and driving in later life from our findings so far. Just very briefly, because I think Ngaire is going to cover some of this context as well, but I just thought I would include some context at the start of the session about why we might even be considering having an interest in older adults in their mobility in later life. So we remain a highly car-dependent country, and particularly outside our main urban centres. And at the same time, we're ageing as a population, and for many older adults, driving has supported their everyday mobility for decades. It's enabled access to many aspects of daily life, including healthcare, social activities, staying connected to family and community, and supports the ability to age in place. These mobility needs do not disappear as people age. What often changes is people's circumstances, confidence, health, routines, and sometimes what feels manageable or desirable. So then a critical question becomes, how can mobility be maintained as driving changes over time? So NZPATHS was partly set up to address or examine these issues for older adults. So we've followed a prospective cohort of 1,181 community dwelling older drivers across 4 waves over 7 years. Alongside this, we also followed 675 family members, mostly adult children. And the family perspective was important because changes in driving, mobility and health seldom happen in isolation. They often unfold within relationships, particularly within families. A key strength of the study is that it's longitudinal. So rather than just being a single snapshot in time about driving and mobility practices, we were able to observe how driving, mobility and related experiences changed over time. And we can examine what happens before people stop driving and what mobility looks like afterwards. And in terms of where our cohort is at now with regards to their driving status, so by the final point of contact, which varied across participants, around 2/3 were still driving and around a quarter had stopped. So now what I'm going to do is step through our 4 broad themes from what we've explored so far that look at how driving and mobility have changed over time within our cohort. So the first theme is that driving change often began well before cessation itself. We were interested in understanding the development and role of driving self-regulation and driving anxiety and the relationship between the two. So driving self-regulation, what is it? So it's the intentional avoidance behaviours such as avoiding night driving, difficult intersections or unfamiliar routes. And these avoidances critically are new and are not a long-term pattern of driving practice. So that's what makes them intentional self-regulation. And then driving anxiety. So this is related to driving-related fears, distress, and in extreme cases can also become a phobia around driving. And from what we know in the literature, it's not necessarily related to any kind of generalized anxiety disorder, but it's a construct in its own right. So the first thing we were interested in is understanding these behaviours and how they might develop over time. So what do their trajectories look like? And we found that for both driving self-regulation and anxiety, they're not static and they change over time. So this figure here on the left is the trajectories or the broad longitudinal patterns for driving self-regulation over time within our cohort. So we found three groupings. Trajectory 1, which is the blue line at the bottom, was almost about a quarter, 24% of our cohort reported no self-regulation or no driving avoidance behaviours across the whole follow-up period. Trajectory group 2, the red line, that's almost 50%, was the largest group, and they reported low avoidance with gradual increases in self-regulation over time. And then our high self-regulation group, trajectory group 3, was just over a quarter of participants at 27%, and they reported consistently high and increasing self-regulation over time. Now, we also looked at this for driving anxiety, and we also saw 3 distinct longitudinal patterns, but slightly different proportions in the grouping. Here, the largest group was trajectory 1, the blue line at the bottom, which was almost half of participants didn't have any driving anxiety at all across the whole follow-up period. Trajectory group 2, the middle group, which is about 30%, is the red line. Here, driving anxiety remained low and stable. And then for trajectory group 3, here we found 1 in 5, so almost 20% of drivers had mild levels of driving anxiety when we started the study, and this anxiety increased across the study period. And then looking at the relationship between the trajectory groups, so 18%, so 2 and 5 of the cohort were in the blue categories both times. So they had no self-regulation or no driving anxiety across the whole study period. And then in terms of having high self-regulation and high driving anxiety, so in both green groups, it was 12%, so just over 1 in 10 of our participants reported high self-regulation and high driving anxiety over the period of study. And then the remainder of participants were a mixed combination of patterns. So then we were interested in, well, what distinguishes higher self-regulation and does it matter? So we found very few health-related measures independently associated with belonging to the higher self-regulation trajectory group. Eyesight difficulties stood out as being associated with higher self-regulation practice, which makes sense because some of the most common avoidance behaviours that were reported related to driving at night and driving particularly in weather conditions where visibility might not be very good. But mobility problems, cognition, depressive symptoms, and broader health measures were not consistently associated once adjusted. Instead, what we did find for self-regulation, it appeared to be more closely related to subjective driving-related experiences. Driving anxiety was particularly important here. So even mild driving anxiety at baseline was strongly associated with belonging to the higher self-regulation trajectory group. And that relationship remained for moderate extreme anxiety as well. In contrast, driving confidence or high driving confidence and high enjoyment of driving appeared protective. In other words, how drivers felt, the anxiety, confidence, and enjoyment associated with it appeared important alongside changes in vision and shaping driving avoidance behaviour over time. So from the literature, we know that self-regulation is not necessarily a concerning behaviour in driving ability. Low levels of avoidance may be adaptive, and choosing not to drive at night or in difficult conditions may help people continue driving safely for longer. What we've found within the cohort is that there may be a broader pattern of concern, and that's the relationship between the high avoidance and the high self-regulation. So higher and increasing driving avoidance, particularly when it sits alongside driving anxiety and reduced confidence, appears qualitatively different from no self-regulation. So for some adults within our cohort, this meant that their driving patterns were becoming progressively narrower while they were still driving. This leads us on to the second theme that we've looked at, and it's what tended to change as people moved towards cessation. And here we used some modelling to look at repeated measures over time and to try and identify what characteristics or factors were associated with stopping driving. So age was strongly associated with cessation, so older age, but after accounting for age and other personal level characteristics, cessation still appeared to sit within a broader pattern of mobility, functional, and driving related change. Unlike the self-regulation findings, several health and functional measures were associated with cessation over time. So here we saw deficits relating to, say, mobility limitations, difficulty with everyday activities, poorer eyesight again, and lower self-efficacy all appeared more common as people moved towards stopping driving. And then at the same time, the pattern around driving-related experiences still mattered. So people were driving less, driving anxiety became more common, and satisfaction with getting places declined. Discussions with family and friends about driving also become more common, reinforcing that driving change often unfolds within families and social relationships. What we haven't found in the transition to stopping driving, we found very little evidence that people were transitioning into alternative transport as their driving changed. Use of public transport, paid transport, community transport, and even travelling as a passenger with family or friend were not consistently associated with cessation over time. And I think that matters because there can be an assumption that as people become less comfortable driving, they gradually move into other transport options. And we saw relatively little evidence of that. And in a highly car-dependent setting, alternatives may simply not be realistic, attractive, or accessible for many people. And then the other null finding, I guess, in our work looking at what's contributed to driving cessation is that we didn't find any level of self-regulation behaviour to be associated with cessation over time. So this confirms or aligns with the earlier finding that maybe some lower levels of self-regulation are actually, or modest avoidance, are adaptive rather than a signal of imminent cessation. So overall, from these findings, we've identified that stopping driving appears to involve changes across mobility, anxiety, confidence, functioning, and relationships, rather than just age-related changes or health changes alone. The third theme is about what happened to mobility after driving stopped. So while still driving, travel patterns were overwhelmingly car-based. Participants relied primarily on driving as their main mode, followed by travelling as a passenger with family or friends. Public and paid transport use remained relatively low across all waves. Among those who stopped driving and continued in the study, we saw considerable continuity rather than transition. Mobility generally continued, but differently. Across everyday activities such as shopping, healthcare, and social trips, transport was maintained largely through informal support. Family and friends became central, and travelling as a passenger became the most common way of getting around. Walking also remained important for some trips. Public, paid, and community transport were used by some participants, but they did not emerge as primary modes after cessation. At the same time, unmet transport need remained common, with many former drivers reporting being unable to get to all the places they wanted to go. Taken together, albeit with knowing that it's a smaller sample of former drivers that were able to be interviewed, but the findings from this group suggest that continuity of car-dependent mobility rather than transition to alternative systems as people move past being able to drive. So mobility shifted from independent travel to supported travel, with informal networks playing a central role in maintaining access and participation. And then the final theme is the planning gap. So many older adults had considered the possibility of eventually stopping within our cohort and had discussed their driving with others, but very few had actively prepared. Across the study, around half had thought about cessation, but only around 10% had made any concrete plans. And importantly, this pattern remained fairly consistent across all 4 waves. When active planning was undertaken, this planning activity was not associated with when cessation occurred. In other words, planning didn't appear to bring cessation forward or delay it. However, when the planning had occurred, for the majority of former drivers and family members that we were able to interview, they described it as having helped adjustment afterwards. just another note of caution that the number of active planners was small and the former driver sample was also more limited. So these are precautionary findings around the role and benefits of planning. But even so, they do seem to suggest that planning may matter less for when people stop driving and more for how people adapt when the change happens. So what do I think the broader implications are from the work from what we've been able to undertake so far? First, earlier conversations may matter. So within families and clinical practice, there may be opportunities to recognise changes earlier. We've seen increasing anxiety, changing driving patterns, reduced confidence or dissatisfaction with getting places, may be earlier signs, and not only at the crisis point or licence renewal stage, but as part of the routine conversations about mobility. Second, stopping driving is not the end of mobility needs. What we observed was continuity rather than transition. Mobility often continued, but increasingly through family and friends, and relatively limited evidence of movement into formal transport alternatives. This raises questions about how well a transport system can support mobility in later life, particularly where informal support networks are not available to anyone, and the informal support that is being provided may be masking gaps in the formal transport provision available. And finally, planning. Alongside early conversations, we need mobility planning. Mobility transitions over time and not just at the point of driving cessation. Very few older adults actively planned for a future without driving, and planning itself was not associated with when people stop driving, but may be supportive for helping people cope. And it should be considered alongside planning for other aspects of later life. And just finally, I think there's some more broader system questions here that we need to consider. So as the population ages, planning for mobility needs to extend beyond driving alone. Maintaining mobility in later life is unlikely to sit within the transport system only. It touches housing, service access, urban design, healthcare, social support, and how communities are organised, as some examples. So perhaps the broader challenge is not simply preparing people to stop driving, but thinking more deliberately about how the various systems can support mobility to be maintained as people's circumstances change. And as I said, this is just a snapshot of where we're at with NZPATHS at the moment. There's more work ongoing. One of the areas is actually looking at the impacts of driving cessation on health and well-being. And so there's some preliminary work in that space, which will add more to the story very soon. And then just like to acknowledge these various people involved, the funders, the advisory group representatives, the various investigators and research team members, and most critically, our very generous participants, our older adults and their family members, for their time and commitment to the study over a 7-year period. Kia ora. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca, for that holistic summary of your work. I'd now like to introduce Professor Ngaire Kerse, who will be speaking from a practitioner perspective. Thank you, Ngaire.
We can't hear you, Ngaire.
Now that would help. Can you hear me now?
Much better.
That's much better. It's a lovely slide, but
Thank you very much. We're a good team. Okay, so I was saying that I'm Ngaire Kerse. I am a GP and the Joyce Cook Chair in Ageing Well at the University of Auckland. And I've had years of doing driving assessments. I thought I'd talk a little bit more about the crashes and about the assessment. And I just want to start by saying that it's the most controversial topic I've ever given talks on, and the most controversial topic I've ever done research about. So enjoy me in this, this ride that we're going on. So older drivers in New Zealand, thank you very much, Rebecca, for the wonderful NZPATHS study. It has been a fabulous contribution to our knowledge. So we know about driving, it maintains independence and social connection, especially in areas where we're limited public transport. And as Rebecca says, I confirm we're a very high driving country where people do continue to drive because I think they have to. Older drivers do tend to avoid risky driving. In general, they drive less, but when they do crash, they face excess physical disability because they are fragile. So they drive less, when they do crash, they're injured more. We have safety policies and we're supposed to have a forgiving road design to accommodate older driver need. That's very variable around the different parts of New Zealand. And our ageing population means that these road safety policies and the infrastructure and the licensing systems in New Zealand have become even more important than they were previously. So how many drivers have we got? So, oops, sorry, go back again. There's about 600,000 drivers who are age 65 and older. And there's about 3.5 million total drivers. So not the whole 5 million of us, but a good, most adults have a license. It's about 100,000 over 75, about 40,000 85 to 89, about 10,000 age 90 and above, and about 1,000, probably 1,500 over 95, and a good sizable number over 100. So isn't that marvelous? We have flourishing drivers. And so aging will continue in New Zealand, and so will drivers. So watch out for our older drivers and cherish them. So those who have better health and actually better vehicles, that both of those things support ongoing licensing. The reasons we have high drivers is that we have absent or no public transport available, and that promotes driving. We have now medical checks at age 75. Now, I'm old enough to remember when everybody aged 75 and age 80 and 2 years thereafter had to do an on-road driving test, just like when you were 15. Of course, you can't get your license when you're 15 now, you have to wait till you're 17. But those now, they downscaled that about 10 or 12 years ago to just a medical check. So they land that responsibility on the desk of the GP, the nurse practitioner, and the geriatricians to ensure that our older population are fit to drive. So we had a part of the NZPATHS which was about this driving assessment. And wonderful Mary Butler is a great researcher, and she did focus groups with GPs. And I have to say, there was the most heated debates within that group that I'd ever seen. And those heated debates continue. I brought it up at our peer group the other day, and there were GPs, there was about 10 of us, standing up, shouting, it should be this, it should be that. There were others who just said, look, it's all too hard. And that's exactly what happens when you talk to GPs about it, because, of course, there's a longitudinal relationship with the older person. The practitioners want to do things in the interests of their patients. However, sometimes it is no longer safe to drive, and they have to take that, what is seen as a right, away. So it's a real balance between advocacy and public safety that has landed in this area of fitness to drive assessment. So as Rebecca mentioned, older drivers do self-regulate, but not all of them. They have preferred familiar routes and stick to the daylight usually to reduce risks and improve safety. So let's see, try this one. Okay, yes. Crash frequency. So older drivers have fewer crashes. I have a graph about this in a moment. Overall, because there are fewer older drivers, certainly the predominance of crashes in the ages 16 to 29 However, the severity or the consequences of those crashes are worse for older people with more injurious or fatality events because they are fragile. Crash locations tend to be urban intersections turning right, also complicated areas of high traffic volumes. The implications for safety are that driver ability is important, but road design is also really important. And it is not related to age itself. It is related to driver ability. And that's very difficult because we have an age-based regulation around licensing restriction. At the beginning of life, licensing restriction until you're in your 20s, and at the end of life from 75 onwards. So this graph here, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but you can see the driver age group along the bottom. And this up the top, this y-axis is death and serious injury. So the serious crashes per 1 million people, and it's per 1 million VKT, which stands for vehicle kilometers traveled. So this is a rate of crashes per vehicle kilometers traveled. So most of our drivers who do the big kilometers are in the middle, and they have a low crash rate. The crash rate is high at the beginning of our driving and at the end of our driving life. So while older drivers drive less, they have a serious and death injury rate that is higher per kilometre driven. And I think that's quite important. The common injuries for older people: head injuries, chest injuries, fractures, and these severely affect independence and recovery. The vehicle infrastructure safety. So modern safety features of cars do make it easier. That whole keeping your distance and keep staying in the lane. There's not that many actual highways in New Zealand to stay in the lane with those modern features. And improved road design does help. Signage is very important. The public health impact, of course, is that higher injury severity increases healthcare demand and affects families, rehabilitation service, and most importantly, the older person themselves. This next graph is the driver contribution to fatal and serious light vehicle crashes. So, as you know, any crash with injury is investigated. Sometimes the road is closed if there's a fatality. So there is an investigation that goes on, and the NZTA has a team who make an assessment of how much of the cause of this crash is related to driver contribution, which is the driver contribution partial and no contribution. So this is completely nothing anybody could do things about. So you can see that in those middle ages, that contribution is the minority. Oops, sorry, did it again. Let me just go back. But at the lower end, in young people, and at the higher end, there's a higher driver contribution to that crash that caused death or serious injury. And we've all heard terrible anecdotal examples of this, that where an older driver transgressed, but there's also a fair amount of alcohol and bad behaviour in the youth as well. So there's a balance here. But the other thing that's important is that while older drivers might not be as safe in their car as younger groups, they are also less safe as a pedestrian. They're more likely to get knocked over at the lights, partly because they're less likely to be able to cross the road in time. They're more likely to have an injury, a road vehicle injury as a pedestrian than other groups as well. So why should this be? Judgment and perception errors. Older driver crashes often result from errors in judgment, perception, vision and cognitive decline, age-related changes there are implied, and reduce the reaction speed or the ability to take in that information, digest it, process it, and react appropriately when they recognise hazards, if they recognise hazards. That is balanced by reduced risk-taking behaviours. So older drivers tend to avoid risky behaviour like speeding or alcohol-impaired driving. And there are some intervention strategies here, recognising that Sensory, cognitive, and physical functions are all required for driving. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the risk factors in the driving environment. So if you notice the sign here, it's very funny, because the right-hand lane is the fast lane, and here is a turn off from the fast lane, which looks like it's a road crossing or it's either crossed out. So confusing things like this are no good for older drivers either. They're no good for me. Of course, speed is an important aspect for the crash force and poses risks to vulnerable users. Driver distraction factors. You're not allowed to watch movies as you're driving. I know a guy who was making coffee as he was driving and with a little machine, and that caused an accident. It's much safer to drive with a companion. You're both looking out for hazards and other things, and older drivers who drive with a companion are safer. Mobile phones are very dangerous. They're dangerous even if it's got nothing to do with your hands. It's the distraction of talking to somebody who's not actually there observing the road as well. So distraction factors. Medication effects. I do run a course on medication use for older people through the University of Auckland. And it's very important to think about that as you're thinking about alertness and awareness. And then, of course, there's alcohol and other drugs, which don't feature as much with older drivers. Busy intersections, high traffic volumes, increase the complexity, and then you have the weather and the time of the day. So there are challenges. Now, there's a bit of a balancing act depicted in this here picture. So the off-road driver assessment pictures the public safety against the personal health and the personal relationship with the person. And it is a core aspect of primary care, whether it's a GP or a nurse, of late, meaning in the last, since COVID actually, because primary care is under pressure. There's tended to be a standardized process that people go to get their driver's license, and that's included a mandatory cognitive assessment done by a nurse or someone else. The driving assessor is often somebody who's not known to that older person, and that is not ideal because they don't have an in-depth knowledge about their social and their chronic illness profile. And so that is problematic. So thinking about driving, it's one of the most complex things we do. It's competing multiple complex attentional tasks. Attention here, attention here, attention down here, the feet and the hands, creates a load on the cognition, and it is dynamic. There are multiple cognitive processes happening at once. So that includes attention, memory, executive functioning, visuospatial perception, and decision making. So executive functioning, just to mention one of those things, is what cognitive flexibility is about, and inhibitory control. So it's really essential for planning, prioritizing, problem solving, and controlling your impulses. You can imagine how important that is for driving ability. So the components of the assessment that we all do, the vision is mandatory. Of course, that's very important. If you can't see, you can't drive. And that's mandated. Usually it involves a check over of the cardiovascular system. You obviously can't be having seizures or have recently had a stroke. The musculoskeletal system, you've got to be able to get in and out the car and use your arms and legs. And then there's cognition. Long-term continuity between the assessor and the person is really desirable. The relationships that clinicians and primary care people have with their older patients are really important. And one of the outcomes of the focus groups and the other qualitative work we've done is that GPs know, nurse practitioners know about the need to stop driving. If that conversation can be started way before it needs to be happened, it gives the power back to the older person to make that decision about cessation. The predictors of crashes in research. I haven't mentioned them on the slide, but of course, having crashes before, predict having another crash. Dings in your car predict crashes in the future. There's also things that with your vision that are not just acuity. Of course, acuity is important, but this thing called field of view, which is the ability to perceive something happening in all areas, to process it, and then to react. So that's quite a complicated test that's done at your optometrists. Medical conditions, of course, seizures, arrhythmias, significant drug use, uncontrolled congestive heart failure, very poorly controlled diabetes. All of those things are important in being safe to drive. And then there's cognition. So the issue about cognition is very interesting, because there seems to be that we all now do a global cognitive screen when we do a driver assessment. The global cognitive screen is good for uncovering cognitive problems, but it is not closely related to driving ability. The things about cognition that are more related to driving are reaction times. That takes both cognition, processing times, and motor function. Visual spatial tasks, which are this thing called the trail B, which I'll show you. So some people with MCI, mild cognitive impairment and early dementia, are safe to drive. People who are going for a passenger endorsement or a heavy truck driver's license are not allowed to have any cognitive impairment. So if I'm doing a heavy truck assessment, I will always do a cognitive screen as well, because it's mandated. However, for a general driving assessment, unless you really suspect that a person is having trouble with their cognition, it's not really essential. It doesn't predict driving ability. So in the future, we're hoping we'll have better signage, lighting, the vehicle tech will improve, training can enhance driver safety, and driverless cars are on the way. And potentially this will overcome some of these difficult balancing acts that driver assessment brings to primary care. Okay, this is the Trails Making B test. And what you've got to do is go from 1 to A, then 2 to B, then 3 to C. So you've got to find the 1 and go to A. You've got to go from A to 2, and then you've got to 2B, and then B to 3. And so you have the instructions once, and then you just go for it. You can see how that's about noticing and reacting. And that is a timed test. This is something you can all practice. Here's another visual spatial thing. These are complicated little figures which you have to copy. And so we don't use that one. It's quite complex. And reaction times. Reaction times can be assessed with computerized reaction things. Some people try to do this by getting people to catch pens. Some people do it by getting them to point with their feet. It's not a perfect science, but there are some ways to do that. There are also an on-road driving test, an on-road safety test, which used to be mandatory, but now it is optional. It is not really optional. The assessor can say, there is some concern in my mind about this person's ability. Please, could they have an on-road safety test? They tick that part of the DL9, and when you take it back, then you're asked to have an on-road safety test. GPs can also, and nurse practitioners can also recommend an OT specialised driving assessment, which is available some places and is not free, but it is very useful when people have MCI. It goes into what they can and can't do, and it's quite useful for coming up with restrictions and education, but it is not free. So I see driving assessment as a can of worms. I think we need to be very balanced in our protection of the public and their promotion and advocacy for older people. The very few people who have that form of dementia where they are in complete denial and have no knowledge of their deficits cause the greatest problems, because they persistently continue to drive when they are not safe. And I don't think anybody knows what to do about them or for them. Okay, that's the end of my spiel. Oh no, here's my last 2 slides. So driving is complex. Here's a roundabout in Wales. You can see I would really hesitate to enter this roundabout. This roundabout goes clockwise on the edges and counterclockwise on the middle. And so I'll just leave you with that, with the thought that assessment is complex, and please be kind to your assessors. They are trying to do their best. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ngaire. We've all got our minds boggled by that roundabout. That was really interesting. Thank you. And interesting to discover what's mandatory and not mandatory in those driving assessments. So our final speaker is Pete Matcham, policy analyst and community advocate. Over to you, Pete. Don't forget to unmute. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I don't have a flashy presentation for you, so you're probably going to have to put up with staring at my face for a bit. So there I was, tootling off down to town, down our windy little road, when I saw a temporary 30k sign, slowed down, went round a corner, saw a temporary traffic light sign, and then, surprise, surprise, round the next corner, there were some traffic lights at red. So I stopped and I sat there, contemplating the infinite, when this car sails round the bend behind me, swerves out to pass, and merrily sweeps past the red light, until about 30 yards beyond, they screech to a halt, and then spend the next 2 minutes jiggling back and forth, trying to reverse. Luckily, there was nothing coming the other way. Why do I mention this? To make the point that the problem around older people driving is not an intellectual exercise, but a practical issue with real-world consequences. Okay, I'll admit to bias. Unlike the other panellists, I've got skin in the game. I've been through the driver's age-related medical assessment twice. But as my preferred transport mode, when not walking the dogs, is cycling, I get to see the behaviour of drivers, young and old, from the perspective of someone they could kill. So weeding out those who should not be driving is a vital personal interest. For those who don't know me, my work background is in analysing complex problems involving differing worldviews. I've visited academia, but never wanted to live there, and my academic qualifications have been a side benefit of real-world issues I was paid to address. However, my main focus over the last 15 years or so has been in the area of transport policy and how this affects older people. During that time, the issues that were raised most frequently with me by Grey Power members was the condition of footpaths and the inability to cross the road safely. So let's pause there and reflect. The age-related medical assessment for drivers and its infamous mental acuity test creates a lot of wailing and beating of breasts, but it was not the issue that troubles most GP members when it comes to transport. As an older driver and an analyst, I'm concerned with the practicalities of policy, who they affect and how, and more importantly, how they can be tweaked to be most effective. So straight away, there's a lot of stuff in there that is in conflict. The worldview of actors, the economic, or more likely the financial cost of intervention versus doing nothing, and above all, the impact on politicians and how it affects their re-election chances are the most important considerations in any policy intervention. In other words, to use the jargon from my academic background, it's a mess. And we can be sure before we start that there is no right answer, nor objectivity. Any data used to support a given position is filtered through the actor's worldview and discarded if it conflicts with that worldview. So any solution or compromise will leave some who will never accept that outcome as valid. With that caveat in mind, let's start at the beginning. Why do older people have to have a series of examinations to see if they are medically fit to drive? And does that assessment have any value? The first problem is what it says on the label. An age-related driving test is rightly perceived as age discrimination. Again, let's pause and consider what the furore would be if there was a similar test based on ethnicity. So is there any justification for this discrimination? The argument, of course, is that older people are at higher risk to themselves and others. Does the evidence support this? New Zealand has one of the worst correlated death and serious injury rates in the OECD for over 65s. But there is no indication that ageing of itself increases the risk of accident for drivers, their passengers, or other road users. Countries with demographically substantially older populations than ours also have much lower DSI rates for that cohort. In New Zealand, whatever the mode of transport we use, the risk of a DSI crash per unit of exposure, e.g. time of travel or kilometres travelled, increases as we age and more rapidly when we pass 80. This applies whether we are a driver, car passenger, cyclist or pedestrian. Bear in mind, though, that we're talking about DSI crashes, so a major factor in the higher representation of older people is down to the increased fragility that comes as our bodies age. In contrast, compared to other age groups in the 70 to 79 and 80 cohorts have the lowest number of fatal crashes, and only the over 80 cohort have slightly more injury crashes than the 40 to 49 cohort. In other words, middle-aged drivers in New Zealand are just as good, if not better, at killing each other on the roads, and therefore as much in need of some form of test before allowing them to continue driving. So what can we do to reduce the risk of older people dying or being killed on our roads? Most of us are all too well aware that we're not as young as we used to be, and that bits don't work as well as they did. So most older people, probably about 80% based on the latest survey for the AA, will self-regulate and come to terms with the fact that they should stop driving, usually with some judicious encouragement by spouses and children. The same survey indicates that they then mostly settle into new travel reality quite happily. These probably correlate with those termed anxious drivers in the AA survey, and are probably those for whom there is least concern. They choose routes that are familiar and that they believe are the safest. They limit the driving to daylight hours and avoid driving in adverse weather conditions wherever possible. Yet they still have DSI accidents at a far higher rate than their contemporaries in Europe. Turning again to CAS data for enlightenment, there is a definite pattern to the crashes. Most are vehicle to vehicle, most occur at intersections or when turning against oncoming traffic that has the right of way. For those aged 80 and over, the percentage of angle collisions, typically again at intersections, is more than double that of the youngest age group. CAS data also shows that the older drivers tend to be legally at fault in their collisions. Over the last 10 years, the top causal factors for DSI crashes involving people over 65 have remained steady, with poor observation being the most common. Other recorded causes, such as failed to give way or stop and incorrect lane of position, could well also have root cause of observational failure. So what's going wrong, and what can we change to improve things? Again, we can eliminate the stuff the current regulatory regime covers, the easy physical stuff, eyesight, mobility, etc., that can be measured and for which the outcome is mostly accepted, however grudgingly. However, it's the stuff that is not being tested that is critical in addressing the high-risk situations identified. Car manufacturers spent a lot of time and effort cocooning us from anything that reminds us of the reality of the outside the car. We're insulated from wind and weather, and now the main selling point is the complexity of in-car entertainment and the ability to remain in constant contact with social media and phone communications. Road engineers have also prioritised road design that minimises driver interaction with the wider environment, usually in the interests of so-called free-flowing traffic, all of which contribute to the invisibility of pedestrians and cyclists, and ultimately motor traffic that does not fit with the driver's expectations. As I mentioned in my presentation at the NZAG conference a few years ago, the invisible dance and gorilla experiment shows how concentrating on a task can blind you to the events in your environment that is not related to that task. This is exacerbated if the event or object is outside of your expectation and experience. In our case, a pedestrian, cyclist, or even another car when one does not usually exist. The "sorry mate, I didn't see you" crashes. So this indicates a reason for the lesser risk of DSI for anxious drivers. Fear is a great motivator, and so they're more concerned with and hence aware of their immediate environment, where a confident driver, whether or not their confidence is justified, will sail on obliviously. Making drivers feel less safe is ironically a key method to improve safety by causing them to modify their behaviour. Reducing the perceived width of the carriageway to the extent that the driver is concerned about potential damage to their car, and of course their body, is the most commonly effective means of reducing speed. As I said, multiple surveys have shown that drivers who are most anxious and who are often less healthy have a lower crash rate than their confident and healthy peers, indicating that self-pacing was successful in keeping them safe, although not safe enough. From the information sent to us by members, it is clear that, as Great Powers member that is, it's clear that they are not being given the information needed for them to understand what is being evaluated and why in the GP's assessment. And all I can say there is what we can be really to echo what Ngaire mentioned. So what we can be confident of is that the mental acuity test is actually having a negative effect, in that it is causing far more anxiety amongst the participants, with no evidence of any causal relationship with driving, and its increasing irrelevance to real life only discredits the whole process. I mean, come on, who uses analog clocks these days? Well, actually, I do. But don't ask me the date, which the GP obviously did, to which my standard reply is, I haven't a clue. If I need to know, I'll look at my calendar. And as for time, the dogs tell me when it's meal time and time for a walk, and that's all I really care about. So there's a definite disconnect there between what matters to people and the test. However, I've really encouraged again to hear Ngaire mention that the tests which I've similarly identified as being actually relevant. And these involve visual attention, because again, to come back to my basic point, is that the situational awareness of drivers in New Zealand is appalling. And anything which we can do to improve that by both using the right tests and by training up before and afterwards, is only going to be of benefit to everyone. So let's get on, work together, and get these adopted. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pete, for that interesting presentation with some explanation of the things that are really important to older drivers. Thank you very much. So